myocarditis or cardiomyopathy population, while they have decreased function, ultimately it may be their arrhythmias that push you over the edge and needing to actually cannulate them to ECMO. And even if they don't have myocarditis or cardiomyopathy, if you have profound enough arrhythmias, you may end up having to go on. We had a patient in the cardiac ICU last year who had such bad jet junctional ectopic tachycardia that no matter what I was doing to try and control it, I was having difficulty controlling it. We weren't perfusing very well, and we were this close to cannulating to ECMO. And we waited a couple more hours, and it got better. And this is just to drive home the point about what you actually get. So when you have a patient who is on not on ECMO and in heart failure, so this is the usual lactate scale that people are used to, not our crazy one here. So I happened to be on service / on call for this lovely patient. So they had lactate levels in the 20s. I did actually have to argue with the cardiac surgeon at the time for quite a while about whether that was a good enough sign of low cardiac state in order to cannulate to ECMO. And then you can see how the lactate falls off once you actually take over for the heart. And I think this slide is a great example of why cardiac ECMO is so good. So this is the same patient, and you can see that these x-rays are just 12 hours apart. So this is the patient right after cannulation, or are they cannulated? They're not cannulated, right? What is wrong with my eyeballs today? Where are their cannulae?
The right one is, the left one's central, no?
Yeah.
What is it?
No.
No, I can't.
You're so kind
I think,
The
why
right-
can't I see the cannulas right now? What is wrong with me?
The one
The one on the left is cannulated.
No, that isn't a neck cannula.
It's not a neck
No.
cannula, but it's running over the neck.
I think that's correct. I think they are actually both cannulated. I don't know what's wrong with my brain right now. I apologize. It is the same patient. Even if this is cannulated, it was immediately after cannulation. But it just shows you how much the cardiac silhouette can come down once you start decompressing the heart, because here you can see all the right atrial dilation that this patient has over here. And so immediately you can get rid of that right atrial dilation, and the ventricular border is smaller also. So decompressing that heart, not only are you providing a better blood supply to the body, but then this is the slide, what we were talking about with the coronary arteries and how you improve your coronary artery perfusion, so then you can have better cardiac recovery in your patient. All right, I'm tired of driving home that point. So what I thought I would do for the last few minutes is just talk specifically about a cardiac lesion to have you guys start thinking about how blood flows and what you need to think about with the ECMO circuit. So hypoplastic left heart syndrome. So you have a heart, very complicated schematic here, right? So you have this patient who, you'll hear me when you rotate through the cardiac ICU with me, right, Jose? What's my rule gonna be? Follow the blood. Follow the blood from the beginning into the end, and especially when you're cannulated ECMO, you have to start thinking about your ECMO circuit. So in a hypoplastic left heart, SVC, IVC are going to the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. And then in this case, you can see that this patient is pre-operative. So it's going out the pulmonary artery, and then going to the lungs, coming back in pulmonary veins to the left atrium. It has nowhere to go except for left atrium to right atrium. So there has to be blood supply to the body. So in this case, you have a PDA, and your PDA is shunting right to left, and that's what's supplying your body with blood, right? So then this patient goes to the operating room and has a Norwood and a BT shunt. So what happens in the Norwood and the BT shunt? So when you do a Norwood and a BT shunt, if you had no blood supply going to the body except for through that duct, you've got to establish blood supply to the body. So they go through and they take the pulmonary artery and they anastomose it to the aorta. And so now your SVC, IVC, right atrium, tricuspid valve, RV are all going out to the body. And then you have to have blood supply to the lungs, and so they put in this case, a BT shunt. So a shunt running from the right subclavian or right internal carotid into your pulmonary artery. Okay, so now life should be hunky-dory, right? You're mixing, you're perfect, you have blood supply to your lungs, you have blood supply to your heart. But unfortunately, it doesn't always go that smoothly. Okay, there we go. So this patient was unable to be decannulated from bypass and comes back to the cardiac ICU intubated, or on ECMO, pardon me. So now, you guys walked me through this. I walked you through how their blood was flowing if they weren't cannulated to ECMO. Now you guys tell me how their blood is flowing if they're cannulated to ECMO through central cannulation. What's your ECMO circuit doing for you? So SVC, IVC are going to the right atrium. What's happening on the right atrium?
The venous cannula takes out most of it.
Okay, so your venous cannula is taking a bunch out and is going to do something with it, which we'll come back to. You have some blood supply going through the tricuspid valve, out your neo-aorta and out to your body.
So
Okay,
that's gonna be high. No, that's gonna be high.
what's gonna be high?
The sats on that might be more elevated than we're used to.
Because,
Because you have an atrial septic.
right, and so all we've done so far is trace from systemic out to systemic. So there had to be pulmonary blood supply at some point in time. And so that's where we see coming off our systemic circulation that we've got a BT shunt in place. So then that means you still have blood supply going to the lungs and coming back. And so then what is happening in the left atrium is you have all left to right shunt to the right atrium. So your venous cannula, your ECMO circuit is not only getting your systemic venous drainage, but is also getting your pulmonary venous drainage. So in this case, you are decompressing your patient probably 75 to 90% because in essence, you have a left atrial vent in this patient. So your SpO2 isn't going to be as helpful to you, even though you'll hear us still talk about it. So then this goes through your venous cannula to your ECMO circuit. So it goes through your pump, it goes through your oxygenator, and then it comes back to a cannula into the transverse aorta gorge. And then where does blood go?
Retrograde to the coronaries and down to the descent.
Okay, and anywhere else?
Systemic.
And out to VT shunt to the.
Right, and so this then is the trick when you start thinking about cardiac ECMO, is that now your aortic cannula is, you're starting to think about VV ECMO in a way, in the sense that everything that you're giving through your aortic cannula isn't necessarily going to the body, because now you have a shunt that can run straight into your lungs. So the question is what's your pulmonary vascular resistance like, and do you or do you not have a large amount of blood flow through that VT shunt? If you have a lot of blood flow through the VT shunt and it's going to the lungs, you'll still have good venous return to your circuit, right? Because what's in the left atrium has nowhere to go except for to the right atrium, and it's going to be picked up by your ECMO circuit all over again. But your problem is going to be that you are losing systemic blood flow because it's all running through your VT shunt. Make sense? So what do you do?
Decrease your SVR.
Right, so that's good, starting to think the strategy through. So you're trying to force blood to go somewhere. So if it's mostly going to the VT shunt because the PVR is lower than your SVR, what happens if you drop your SVR? And it can be counterintuitive, right? Because what if your patient is relatively hypotensive, does anybody feel really good about starting a vasodilator on them? No, but this is again where you're thinking about the physiology of your ECMO circuit, and if you understand that, then that's what allows you to make a decision, like saying, yeah, I'm going to start this baby on nitroprusside, and if I drop my SVR, maybe I won't have as much blood flow through my VT shunt, and I will actually end up having a higher mean arterial pressure in the patient overall. The other place that that comes into play to think about is that when you have a patient that you've been coding before you go on, as a part of your code, not only do you have high catechols because you're running a code, but your patient has high catechols because you've been giving them epiboluses all throughout the resuscitation. So when you're resuscitating them and you're doing chest compressions, you have some amount of circulation. Hopefully it's okay circulation, but you don't know. Now all of a sudden you take that patient and you try and put them on ECMO, and if you weren't delivering the epi before, you certainly are delivering the epi now throughout their bloodstream. So now they're on centrifugal pump ECMO, and you don't get as strong a forward flow. So if they have very high SVR, it could be that you don't have very good flow through your circuit. And even though their SVR is high, if the flow is low enough, you still are gonna have inadequate mean arterial pressures in that patient, right? And so sometimes in those kids, it's just a question of how bad are your flows and what direction do you think things are going in? Is it that you have a map that's okay and your flows aren't high enough to sustain you over time, you think, but they're good enough for the moment, and so if you give this kid time to metabolize all the epi that you gave, life's gonna be fine and this process is gonna reverse itself? Or do you give that patient nitroprusside because, again, even though their pressure is low, you think that if you drop the SVR that the flow is gonna go up at a higher rate, and so actually they're gonna end up with a higher mean arterial pressure now that you decrease their systemic resistance. Does that make sense, that balance I'm talking about? So again, this is where really thinking about your physiology of preload and afterload is important. And when you're standing at a cannulation, there's so many variables in play. Because you're cannulating, the patient is sick, they're always gonna bleed when they do a cannulation, so they're always gonna be hypovolemic. You have a brand new venous cannula, you have a brand new arterial cannula, and then you have some kind of SVR out in your patient if you're doing a VA cannulation that you're having to think about and modulate. Now, what if this patient is cannulated, what if a patient is cannulated to VV ECMO? What's your downstream resistance? Where's the cannula? Right atrium. So venous, so it's in the right atrium, and you're losing venous return to the ECMO circuit, it's going through, and then it goes back to the right atrium. So what's your downstream resistance when you're in VV ECMO? Right atrium goes to the tricuspid valve, goes to the right ventricle, through the pulmonary valve. And you had an echo on this patient before you went on to make sure you understood the anatomy. So they don't have tricuspid stenosis, they don't have pulmonary stenosis. So then what's the downstream resistance in VV ECMO?
Could be systemic as well as pulmonary vascular resistance.
It's pulmonary vascular resistance, right? Because your LV is in between your ECMO circuit and your SVR. So your SVR is not going to affect your VV cannulation unless your LV function is down, in which case you were going on VA ECMO to begin with because you knew you had poor LV function. Because these kids who have pulmonary hypertension before they get cannulated to ECMO always have echoes.
You're no longer talking about hypoglycemia.
Yeah, right.
No,
Oh,
sorry.
okay.
You're talking
Oh.
about-
I was like,
yeah.
I was like, you-
So it's like-
I was like,
Sorry.
Okay.
No, because in my mind, you would never put a hypoplastic left heart.
Yeah.
So I didn't make that leap with you guys. So in VV, not in a hypoplastic left heart, your downstream resistance is your pulmonary vascular resistance,
Okay.
not
Yeah,
your
that makes
systemic
sense.
resistance. So I'm just saying
Thank
that's
you.
different.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. I just didn't realize why it's taking you guys so long to come with me on my journey. That's because I didn't explain it very well. But being able to follow those blood flows is really important to then be able to troubleshoot, because so if you have a non-hypoplastic left heart on VV ECMO who is hypotensive, is starting that patient on a vasodilator going to make your life any easier? No, it's going to make your life worse, because this is all about either their LV filling or their LV function or their RV function, and making them hypotensive is certainly not going to help you. Now are you all with me? Good job. So when it comes, so one thing you can do is drop PVR in those patients, drop SVR, going back to the hypoplastic left heart, but what are some of the other things you can do? So some people do turn up the flow rates higher. Again, if you think about recirculation, if you're losing a fraction of your blood supply through that VT shunt, then if you increase your flows, if that fraction remains the same, then you might raise your patient's systemic pressure and still be able to improve situation. But you reach a limit with that, at which point in time that you're just driving up your flows higher and higher and buying hemolysis without actually getting benefit from your patient. So I typically don't go above flows of 150, maybe 160 per kilo. And meanwhile, you're putting a lot of blood supply into your lungs, and so this cardiac patient who didn't have pulmonary disease when they first went on now has pulmonary disease. So it leads to the chronic debate of whether you do or don't take this BT shunt out of circulation if you're really losing a lot of blood flow through the BT shunt. But if we go through and we clip this BT shunt, now when you follow this blood flow along, if the patient wasn't on ECMO, you've got your venous return going to your right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle, out to the body, and then you have 0 going to the lungs. And so most people don't like fully clipping the BT shunt because if your circuit goes down, by definition, your patient is dead. There's no possibility at that point in time of having recovery. So if anything, they tend to band it or tighten it down a little bit so that you have some restriction of flow, as opposed to taking it all the way out of the equation. So cardiac ECMO, kind of, and I bring this up because I think it's a really good example and it comes up very often in the NICU. And it comes up often in the NICU because, so this is a 2-ventricle patient, right? And you've got good blood flow, so venous return going to the right side, out to the lungs, coming back from the lungs through the pulmonary veins, through the left side and out to the aorta. But what if you have a duct open in this patient? And what's happening to the blood flow in this situation? And so why do patients in the NICU get cannulated to ECMO, would you guess? Pulmonary hypertension, because the usually congenital diaphragmatic hernia is what they have. So now, in that case, if you have a patient who has a hypoplastic lung and high pulmonary vascular resistance because they only have one lung, which way is this duct going to flow?
Right to left.
Totally depends on what their systemic resistance is or what their systemic pressure is. And so that's going to be what dictates which way that blood flow goes. And so if you go by and you evaluate this patient, if you look at their preductal sats are going to be 90s, 100s when you're on your ECMO circuit, or just in general, if your lungs are good enough, they'll be up there. But then you have all your blue blood going postductally. So just because you cannulate this kid to ECMO doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to fix their hypoxia as long as they have a duct open if you don't get their pulmonary vascular resistance to drop. And so to me, this is one of the really challenging situations that the NICU has, is in these kids with congenital diaphragmatic hernia who aren't always responsive to vasodilators. So you're cannulating this patient because they're hypoxic, but if part of the reason why they're hypoxic is purely because of the shunt that you have across the ductus, you only have limited things you can do in that situation. That's why I was saying to one of the kids that they asked me to come up and see not that long ago because they were fighting hypoxia so much they had taken off the ventilator with their pulmonary hypertension. And I could not for the life of me figure out what they thought that they were achieving by coming off the ventilator, and all I could think about was all the atelectasis was making the PVR be even higher and cause more right to left shunting across the duct.
Because sort of the reversing of flow through the PDA as well as the increased oxygen is supposed to theoretically help close it. So if you increase the flow through the ECMO circuit to try to increase the systemic pressure or the afterload or however you want to call it, could you help increase the oxygen? It'd help the oxygenation, but it would also help close the PDA as well as reverse the flow there. But of course, it could also worsen the pulmonary hypertension.
Right, so, well, it probably won't worsen the pulmonary hypertension if you increase the flow through your circuit, because you're going to be decompressing the right side so much and then sending it all out to the body. And if the PVR is high enough, your PDA isn't going to retrograde flow into the lungs, right? Because you're going to be bidirectional shunting or bidirectionally shunting, because that's the only way you would make your pulmonary hypertension worse, would be if all of a sudden you shifted and you had this large amount of blood flow across your duct running left to right. So you're not going to make your pulmonary hypertension worse in that situation. It's just a question about how much you're going to help your pulmonary hypertension or not, depending on what your underlying disease process is.
Maybe they thought that when they were debating, they were like rematching like that there was so little flow going to the lungs. They were going to try to have no air going to the lungs, kind of like when you clamp the PA. Maybe they were thinking that that a large percentage of this child's was like that they were maybe only getting like 50 to 60%. Maybe this child was still contributing quite a bit, so maybe they were trying to PQ match.
I don't know how increasing atelectasis would improve the UQ match. Yeah, I know. I tried to understand, and I'm not saying they didn't have a reason for what they were doing, I'm just saying I didn't understand it. I do believe that the neonatologists are excellent physicians and know what they're doing. In this situation, I was just confused and I only spent limited time there, so I'm not saying I have all the information. Were there other questions about this? I think that is it. Oh, I know, I'm just gonna say one thing. So, because I think somebody this morning, I think Rachel said it in passing, that she has not ever had to worry about a duct when on ECMO because of the left to right shunt across the duct. I think she said that. Didn't she say that this morning?
I was on for a brief time.
I thought I heard her say that, and I didn't say anything this morning. I have definitely heard discussions when patients are on ECMO, neonates are on ECMO, and their pulmonary hypertension has either resolved or they never had pulmonary hypertension, and they have big ducts, and now they have big flow through it because they've got a cannula sitting right by the duct, so it's not gonna close on its own, even though it's exposed to this PaO2 of 200, about whether they go in and clip the duct when you're on ECMO. So it's not unheard of.
We did that last year, we clipped a duct over the back of the, like a nut. Very controversial. But then the kid like immediately came up with it, was crazy.
It is interesting, because if you're flooding that much blood flow into the lungs, then your lungs don't function that well because you've got so much blood flow. All right, you guys survived, yay, day one down. All right, if you guys don't mind filling out your evaluation forms, I'd appreciate it. And then tomorrow morning,